David Shirley is a professional actor with extensive experience in theatre, film, television and radio. He is actively engaged in promoting research initiatives across the higher education performer training sector. His own research includes published articles and book chapters related to Stanislavsky, British actor and director training, the American method, the work of Samuel Beckett, and post-dramatic theatre. Prior to assuming the role of executive dean at the Western Australian Academy of Performing Arts, David was the director of Manchester School of Theatre at MMU in the UK. His presentation is titled A Slice of Zoom Life, Uta Hagen's Object Exercises in the COVID Era. David?
Thank you very much, Stefan, and hello everybody from Western Australia. It's a pleasure to be here, and thanks to Jonathan, Stefan and Paul for enabling this webinar, which is very, very interesting. Actually, quite a lot of what I'm going to talk about marries very, very closely to some of the things that Stephanie was talking about. So I'm going to go straight into it. I'm not going to use any visual aids. I'm just going to talk through it, but I'll be very happy to answer any questions. First of all, the Slice of Zoom Life really is an adaptation of the work that was developed by Uta Hagen as an interpretation or a method interpretation of Stanislavsky's work, which was taught to Doreen Cannon in the late 1950s and early 1960s at the Royal Court, and which subsequently really started at the Drama Centre, but then spread to a number of the drama schools. I should say at the very beginning that this work anticipates a theatrical-based training, although one could easily adapt it for screen-based training. This is very much about theatre training. So everything I'm saying is talking about theatre. And I think you've all received the notes and the briefing that's given to the students. So I'm not going to spend too much time on that, although I'll happily answer question of them. First of all, just to say briefly, the aims of the object exercise, or the first object exercise, this is one of three that I teach. It's simply the solo object exercise where students create 15 minutes of their own lives. And the aims are to introduce the notion of theatrical truth for them as distinct from actuality or so-called real life. To underline at an early stage some sense of structure, moving from A to B to C with rehearsed material, making it look as though it was spontaneous. It introduces the notion of objectives, superobjectives, activities, and how these relate and interconnect to each other to enable a true connection to the scenic material. Very, very importantly, it introduces the notion of endowment, objects, environment, place, time, given circumstances, imparting qualities to spaces and that maybe don't pertain to the real life events or the actual sensory experience from which they originate, but it invests those inanimate things often, but also animate things with particular qualities. Very importantly also, it nurtures a reflection about space, the real importance of space in theatrical performance, literal space, imaginative space, connotative space. And it's a very, in this first exercise, there's strong encouragement to work from the self, the identity of the actor, his or herself, rather than any sense of fictional character. I just want to talk about this notion of space. A principal aim of this exercise is absolutely to nurture an awareness of space and time so as to stimulate, in a very real sense, the creative and imaginative muscles that are so essential to an actor's craft. Hence the usual requirement when we do it within a studio for students to bring in personal props, furniture, possessions, etc., to personalize a kind of studio space that bears no resemblance to where the activity might be set. And we think of space in different ways: physical, emotional, time-based, literal, imaginative, historical, intellectual, etc. And many of these experiences are triggered by possessions and objects and places that we go and we visit, and they create a kind of emotional, often, response that's essential to actors. The other part about this, moving this activity onto Zoom, students often feel nervous in this exercise because usually it takes place very much in the early part of the training, and usually there's lots and lots of people sitting and observing the work. And even if you do lose yourself in the world of the theatrical space when it's done in the studio, you always have some awareness of the presence of an audience when it takes place. And there's an interesting development that takes place once you start to move this to Zoom. I have to say, just by way of a sort of setting it up, the way this exercise works, my intuitive response to the COVID situation, all the work I was doing, by the way, was not object exercise. It was all theatre, transformative, reciprocal kind of work, sensory recreation that I was doing in a live studio space with this group of first years at Whopper. But then when we moved to online delivery, I didn't want to sort of drop into a theoretical mode of delivery, as some courses had to sort of front load all the theoretical engagement. I wanted to keep it practical, but it's very hard to do ensemble-based work on Zoom in a kind of meaningful way. So I opted to do these object exercises, thinking that they would sit really, really well in a Zoom place. And to some extent they did. But just talking about Zoom, the choice of activity for these acting situations was, as I said, influenced solely by the emergence of C19. But the portability of the object exercise, where there's no other characters involved and students create their own scenarios, felt really good. And it also meant that students could rehearse and prepare as they usually do, but rather than bring all their belongings into a studio space, and often they get taxis and cars and bring everything in with each other, they could actually present the scenario in the situ where they had been rehearsing them. So how did each session work? Well, the briefing prior to each exercise was the same as it always was. Students are required to rehearse between 45 minutes to an hour for each 15-minute presentation, and to rehearse with rigor and detail, to have a clear objective, a clear super objective, and 3 stress physical activities. And this is where it's very interesting, just looking at your last active analysis, Stephanie. They have to be physical activities, stimulus that live through the body. And the exercise requires students to investigate, rehearse, present segments from their own lives in which they experience what it feels like to be private in public, as if it were here and now. So working private in public as if it were happening spontaneously. So the things that I would say about the benefits of the approach, the rehearsal in their own familiar space, followed by a presentation, very often in the same actual space, afforded a level of authenticity in terms of spatial dynamics that's not available in a studio environment. And one of the byproducts of this is it prompted in the students a feeling of ease and security, the sense that they were not having to do anything artificial. They could be quite naturally in the space. Another advantage was, although the exercise was witnessed, as it always is, by the rest of the group, in this case, each exercise was witnessed by 18 other people, the Zoom environment creates a sort of fly on the wall experience, which makes it much easier for students to lose that self-consciousness that can still pervade a live studio space. The familiar environments that the students working in their own spaces allowed them to develop a closer attention to detail using their own actual possessions and stimulants, own real chairs, own jewelry, own pictures, plants, etc. And that imparted to them the potential for genuine significance and meaning. They still have to endow those spaces because there's a time element involved usually, but it sort of should make the transition a little bit easier, perhaps. And the notion of rehearsal for the students took on a different feel. There wasn't a need to create the space. In most instances, it was already authentically present for them. So it would be in their kitchen or in their living rooms or in their bedrooms. I want to talk about some of the problematics that I discovered through this. And this was, really interesting for them, obviously. And I have to say, I must pay credit to all the students. They all worked extraordinarily hard on this project. They brought real dedication and huge commitment to each of the exercises. They were a very dedicated group of students. But when I try to evaluate it, the first observation I would make is that the conflation of the professional and the private space in this exercise. Initially, it was problematic. Very often students appeared in their night clothes or their dressing gowns, or even would arrive eating breakfast or lunch, which they would never do in a kind of studio space. So we had to get some etiquette into the space. And that was quite interesting, not in a kind of schoolmasterish way, but in the sense that their relationship to space, and if you're actually going into their homes, they behave as though they're at home. They're not behaving as though they're in a workspace. So we had to clarify that for them. This exercise is extremely dependent on the actor's powers of imagination, creating physical, emotional, and imaginative belief in a set of given circumstances and a particular environment at a given time. And I would say that whilst the Zoom location allowed for the actuality of the space to be represented, it possibly did so at the cost of limiting an imaginative process. So that sense of investing and endowing and creating a belief, there was perhaps less of a need for that as experienced by the students, because they felt they didn't need to do that work because they were actually in their room. Whereas if you actually take it into a studio, they have to engage the imagination straight away. Unlike Uta Hagen, Lee Strasberg always said that he preferred, well, I don't like to use the word mind, but he wanted to imagine objects and props, and sometimes showers or imaginary teacups and hairbrushes, etc. And his argument was that if you gave student actors the real possessions, it cuts off the imagination. Now, I know that Uta Hagen would disagree with that, and I fundamentally disagree with it inside a theatrical kind of space. But in a Zoom space, when those objects become your own objects, I can see that there is a limit to the extent of the imagination in terms of the endowment of something takes place. And for me, endowment and use of space is very central to this kind of training. So although the Zoom space provided a really interesting authenticity, it provides a problematic relationship to the actor's use of real objects. So I would say that in the Zoom sessions, the reality of the objects, all of which were real, felt as though they diminished the imaginative process. The fly on the wall effect was very helpful in some respects, but the liveliness of theatre, for which this exercise is a preparation, felt somewhat lost. The ability to actively create and work with a fourth wall, which is part of the training for this exercise, which is an important part of the development, disappeared from this exercise in quite a significant way. The students didn't really need to think about it because very often they would position their laptop in a discrete place in their room where they just completely lost aware of it, sometimes within 30 seconds. And from the point of view of observation, I mean, that's one of the reasons I haven't shared one of them, because you're often going into students' private spaces, and there is a kind of ethical dimension to the work that, you know, at such an early stage of the training, you can't train it. But their loss of self-consciousness was great at one level, but there is also underlying that, and Stanislavsky is very clear of this, an awareness of the fourth wall or the fiction of the actual. It's not actuality, it's a theatrical truthfulness that the exercise is working towards. And the proximity between the performer and the spectator on Zoom is different, and consequently produces, I would argue, a less immediate experience for everybody, for the spectator as well as the actor. There's a couple of thoughts I just want to bring in when I've reflected on it and tried to draw some conclusions. I'm reminded firstly of the French film theorist André Bazin, who in his work talking about photography and about film, talked about or uses the image of a picture in a gallery and says something along the lines, if we look at a realist painting, we appreciate it in its own terms. We appreciate the artistry, the craft, the constructed nature of the work, and the perspective that the artist brings to the work. It shows the way this particular artist views the world. The thing that we don't do when we look at that painting is expect from it to be a window on the world. We're not looking out through a window to see something realistic in that sense. And my sense of theatre is that's exactly how it works. When we look at a theatrical performance, we shouldn't be looking for actuality. We're looking at a representation of life as it is, or as we want it to be, or as the playwright or the creator imagines it to be. And this feels quite relevant to me when I think about it in terms of this exercise, because I think it blurs those boundaries. And I'm not saying that's a bad thing. I'm just interested that it does seem to blur those boundaries. When you're looking at students in their own spaces, recreating their actual 15 minutes, and there's a loss of that sense of the imagination, or it's not so obvious, it points to an interesting question. So for me, I think there's a risk that the Zoom space can potentially conflate a picture gallery approach with the window on the world. And whilst it's not necessarily a bad thing, I think it does raise very important questions in theatrical training about the role and function and engagement of the imagination, both of the actor and the spectator. The other thing that I'm reminded of is the famous incident when Chekhov himself visited the Moscow Arts Theatre, and one of the actors in one of the productions, I think it may have been Ivanov, I'm not quite sure, told him that during the play frogs croaked backstage, dragonflies hummed and dogs howled. And what for, apparently, Anton Chekhov is supposed to have said. And then after a pause remarked that the stage is art. In one of Kramskoy's genre paintings, he has some magnificently drawn faces. What if we cut out the painted noses from one of these faces and substituted a live one? The new nose would be real, but the painting would be ruined. And again, I'm not imparting a value, I'm not making a judgment about Zoom, but it made me think about that in the sense of how we work on Zoom as actor trainers needs to be mindful of the questions that we're asking of the students and how we talk about notions of imagination, authenticity, engagement, presentation, awareness, endowment, really, really important.
2 minutes,
so
David.
for me, 2 minutes, did you say? 2 minutes, very good.
Minutes.
Yeah, okay. And the other thing that I was prompted to think about is that the process of theatrical training, and even in the context of this, which is not ostensibly marked as performance, even in a studio environment, it is very much creates a laboratory workspace. But for student actors and others watching it, the spectator achieves a sense of empathetic engagement through the imaginative process of the actor. And just going back to Stephanie's presentation, we believe in the embodied experiences that are represented to us. And there is that conscious awareness of how a thought or a sense, something internal takes shape in our physical lives, and how that animates us and animates our relationship to space and animates our relationship to the given circumstances. So I suppose the final thought that I'd leave you with, at such an early stage of the training, and these were literally semester 1 acting students, the skill of representation via an imaginary process is absolutely fundamental to the development of a secure technique and methodology. So, and whilst we certainly got a lot out of the Zoom sessions, and the students, I have to say again, worked incredibly hard, my initial expectations of it as a medium through which to teach these classes was a little bit confounded by what they do, or what the medium does to the notion of imagination in young actors who you're trying to get to transform and invest in imagined circumstances with imagined real things in imagined space in imagined time. So lots of it was very good, but overall, I mean, I might write a piece about it. I feel that there are significant questions about this approach to these exercises in a first-year actor training program.